We can trace the complex legal evolution of Indian independence through the pages of this 1952 textbook by K.M. Joseph. The struggle required careful, structural maneuvering inside the government, as much as it required protest outside of it. In 1858, following a massive uprising, the British Crown assumed direct authority over the Indian subcontinent. They projected an image of absolute, immovable imperial dominance. Under this system, Indians were strictly categorized as subjects. They were completely excluded from the legislative processes that governed their own daily lives, taxes, and trade. To maintain this control across millions of square miles, the Raj relied on two pillars: overwhelming military superiority and a massive, exclusionary administrative bureaucracy designed to extract wealth while heavily limiting local power. But this architecture contained a fatal design flaw. The empire required an educated Indian elite to help run its vast administration. By schooling an entire generation in Western political philosophy, while simultaneously denying them actual political agency, the Raj created a massive, volatile vacuum of power. An explosion was inevitable. By the early 1920s, that national pressure was reaching critical mass. The British administration attempted to bleed off the tension by offering a series of minor, cosmetic political reforms. As detailed in this chapter covering 1919 onward, these concessions offered limited local advisory roles, while the British retained absolute veto power. The colonial subjugation remained entirely intact. This failure triggered a strategic awakening among Indian political leaders. Polite requests and isolated protests had failed. To break the empire, they realized they needed a simultaneous assault on two fronts: the streets and the legal system. The strategy became clear. They had to physically paralyze the colonial state through coordinated mass agitation, and then use that immense leverage to rewrite the laws governing the country from inside the assembly halls. The conflict escalated sharply in January 1930. The Indian National Congress formally abandoned their requests for dominion status within the empire. Instead, they issued a formal demand for Purna Swaraj, complete independence. To enforce this demand, they launched the civil disobedience movement. It was anchored by Mahatma Gandhi's historic Dandi March, a 240-mile trek to the Arabian Sea to defy British law. The target was carefully chosen. By illegally harvesting sea salt, the movement bypassed British military strongholds and struck directly at a highly visible economic monopoly. It challenged the moral authority the British claimed over everyday Indian life. Hundreds of thousands joined the protests. Jails overflowed. This coordinated, nationwide street agitation successfully made the country ungovernable, forcing an arrogant empire to finally sit down at the negotiating table. Faced with mass defiance, the British executed a countermaneuver. They attempted to absorb the explosive pressure from the streets by funneling the conflict into a maze of endless bureaucratic commissions and legislative reviews. The primary arena for this high-stakes bureaucratic warfare became the Round Table Conferences held in London between 1930 and 1932. Here, away from the dust of the protests, intense and fracturing debates broke out among the Indian leaders themselves. They argued over how a future independent Indian electorate should be divided, protected, and represented. These internal divisions threatened to derail the entire movement. The tension culminated in the Pune Pact, a high-wire compromise over electoral representation required to prevent the National Front from splintering apart. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar played a vital role in these negotiations. He fought relentlessly to ensure that structural equality and protections for the most marginalized castes were hardwired into the emerging legal framework. The men and women marching in the streets generated the necessary political heat, but it was these grueling, often bitter legislative battles that were actually drafting the physical architecture of the future nation. The collision between mass civil disobedience and constitutional debate produced a tangible result: the Government of India Act of 1935. This legislation established provincial autonomy and provided the initial blueprints for a federal Indian state. The act remained deeply flawed. The British retained significant veto powers and control over defense, yet it legally transferred a massive apparatus of administrative control into Indian hands. It proved the dual-track strategy was working. Relentless agitation had successfully forced the occupying power to legally legislate away its own authority. Fast forward to the years immediately following World War II. The geopolitical reality had drastically shifted. A financially drained and politically exhausted Britain could no longer afford the military cost of suppressing a rebellious subcontinent. The British made final diplomatic attempts through the Cripps and cabinet missions to maintain a unified, loyal dominion. These efforts collapsed under the weight of irreconcilable political demands and the rising influence of the Muslim League. In August 1947, independence was finally granted, but the withdrawal was inextricably linked to the catastrophic, violently executed partition of the land, displacing millions overnight. Simply forcing the British out did not equate to total victory. Looking at the resulting fractured, traumatized landscape, it was clear that the revolution was only half finished. The immediate, monumental pivot was shifting from fighting an imperial enemy to physically unifying hundreds of disparate princely states into a single, functional entity. This task fell largely to the iron resolve of Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel. Simultaneously, the Constituent Assembly gathered. Their ultimate task was to take decades of chaotic struggle, debate, and sacrifice and codify it all into supreme law. They finished their work, choosing January 26, 1950, for the Constitution to take absolute effect. The date was selected to honor the original Purna Swaraj Declaration, made exactly 20 years prior. On that day, Dr. Rajendra Prasad took office as the first president. The colonial system was completely and legally eradicated. The street protests created the fire, but they could not build the state. Independence was finally secured when the passion of that mass agitation was forged into the permanent sovereign iron of the Republic's Constitution.